there are. I still haven't sort of finished with some wording of some amendments that I want to make, which are really focused on making sure that we get reports back. What I'm looking for is a timeline, and it's not the task force, because the task force is now wound up, but a timeline for the decision making that needs to happen from here on in. So, and there is quite a lot of work still to be done. Phil?
I've got an amendment for a follow-up piece of work as well.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, you might even have what I'm looking for. So let's say that Phil's going to move this.
So in relation to community flood defence plans?
Oh, yeah, but there's another matter that needs to be dealt with too. But that's good, yeah. So can you send your amendment through? Okay, it's on here. Who wants to second this so we can get this underway? Andrew, right. Okay, John, would you like to take us through the report?
Presentation live on the system? So you're logging here. Okay.
Send it through to Claire.
I don't have a live login on this side. So just ask for me. Okay, if you have any screen, please.
They're just.
So what we take you through the report that was prepared in response to the second technical report from the task force. This has been a huge, apologies for the delay in it coming out to the councillors, but it's been a huge piece of work and a huge piece of collaboration to get everyone in the organisation across the content to make sure it's got policy and strategic and asset and delivery.
Is your speaker on? Microphone? Yep.
There we go. That's a lot better.
Thank you.
So I'll talk softer. Okay. So it's been a huge collaborative effort to get input from all parts of this organisation, from strategy, policy, operations, and there's several departments involved. We've had it reviewed through SERA, and we've had several reviews through the consultants that have been engaged on it. So it has been a big effort to try and get here, and we do apologise for the delay and the short notice that you've had to consider the material. But if I can take you through the report itself, the report talks about the council strategy. This is the surface water management strategy that was developed in 2009, and that was a 30-year strategy for managing the surface water across the city, and set out a whole lot of objectives about how that was going to be managed. It talks about the effects of the earthquake series in 2010, 2011, and in response to that, the land drainage recovery program that was started to be developed in 2012, which was meant to be a 5-year program of investigations followed by informing a capital program to recover the city from the effects of the earthquake. That was interrupted by a series of significant storm events that we haven't seen the likes of for 30 years. That gave it the urgency, of course, to establish the task force. So this updates Task Force 2, and then we'll walk through the recommendations and then on to the costs. Next slide. Now, the surface water strategy, that set out goals and objectives across the city about how to maintain flood storage and flow capacities, development of ponding areas and wetlands, to limit further developments in high flood risk areas, and to manage the effects of developments on flooding, as well as improving ecosystem health, support recreation, as well as the drainage objectives that we're looking to achieve. And there was 9 of those goals, ranging from improved stormwater efficiency and water quality, etc. Next slide. So to develop that, we need to have some standards. So the standards we work to in the city for the flat land is a 1 in 5 year return period. So that's all we expect our pipe drains to cope with, a 1 in 5 year event. We use a 1 in 20 year event in the hills because of the increased time of concentration of storm events on the steep slopes, so you do get more aggressive flows. And in greenfield areas, we look toward a 1 in 50 year standard for development, excluding stop banks, which we don't welcome into new developments. We have a level of service target of 0.25% of dwellings in the city being permitted to flood in any 1 year. And the irony of that level of service is that wasn't breached in the series of events that we've just experienced. So either we accept that or we come back and we revisit the level of service target, because I don't think it's actually that tolerable from the community's perspective. Next slide. So what are the earthquake effects? We've had significant, substantial tectonic movement as a result of earthquakes. In the east, we've seen land settlement of up to 0.5 metre. In the hills and on the estuary, we've seen uplift of 0.5 metre. So a metre differential across the city. Now that changes the dynamics of the hydraulics and the way that water runs off the land. And that's what we're trying to address. This is 100 years of drainage design that's out the window. We have to start from scratch about how this system operates, and it's no easy task. So that was the reason for setting up the Land Drainage Recovery Program, a series of 63 investigations across the city to look at the effects of the earthquake and how do we recover from that. Next slide, thank you. So as I said, the 63 projects, initially setting out with almost $10 million worth of investigations that are underway, and some are have been developed, like Dudley Creek is quite well advanced. A lot of hydraulic modelling to understand how the flows now work, and that's computer modelling to simulate how water runs off the land. They'll develop issues and options that will feed into capital works programs about how that recovery is then delivered. Next slide, please. So in the task force, you've probably seen from the task force 1, we developed a vulnerability criteria. Vulnerability 1 being those folk who have been flooded in their homes through the habitable floor on at least 2 or more occasions since the earthquakes. Now that eliminates the effect of the extreme event, which is a greater than 50-year event on March 5th. And so that means that they've been flooded through their homes in what would be a normal event, and which is quite high vulnerability. And the next slide just shows you the numbers in each of those categories. If you just advance one more, please. So we've got 77 in category level 1. We have 427 in vulnerability 2. That's where homes have been flooded beneath the floor or at least once through the habitable floor since the earthquakes. And 948 properties that have had access denied because of flooding on the roads and on their section, so they can't get to school, they can't get to work. So that's about 1,500 people in all. That's probably only part of the problem, because when we start looking at the EQC numbers, they have identified over almost 9,000 properties with increased flood vulnerability, and the Insurance Council and its private insurers have got a much greater number of people who have been making insurance claims because of flooding. Don't forget that these numbers have been either identified by the task force members or they have been self-reported by the people themselves. Next slide, thank you. So what have we done to date? We've done quite a bit of work out there with temporary stop banks and clearing waterways and easing bends and taking trees out of rivers, removing obstacles and doing some civil works and some stop banks, for example. The next slide shows the work that we've undertaken, commenced in Tay Street, or the pump station at the end of Patrick Street. Now that takes 2,000 litres per second. When it's completed, it'll take 2,000 litres a second north to the Dudley diversion, and that'll relieve a significant amount of the routine flooding that we've been getting there in recent months. It's on track for a November completion. We hope to be able to use part of the pipeline early. By using skid-mounted pumps, we can make best use of the 900 diameter pipe that goes up to the Dudley diversion. One of the recommendations in the report is a request for additional funding. Now, when we landed the concept design and put that to council after Task Force 1, we had a concept estimate of 4.35 million, and we expressed a fair amount of confidence in that number, and I have to take responsibility for that. Since we've done the detailed design, consulted with the community, lodged the resource consents, and undertaken some more geotechnical work, we have come up with a firmed up estimate of 6.1 million for the completed work, which includes quite a substantial contingency because there's still risk related to the geotechnical ground conditions that we're in there. But there's really good confidence in that number. So that work is proceeding as we speak today. And of course, quite a lot of work in the building. A lot of the costs were due to the soundproofing that we had to put around the generator. The building itself wouldn't be required if it wasn't for the noise that it generated. Next slide, thanks. Another initiative that we had running early in June was a temporary skid-mounted flood pump system that takes flood waters out of the Flockton drain and pumps that across into the Dudley Creek. And we put a knife gate in that confluence so that there wasn't any backflow from the Dudley Creek flowing back into the Flockton area. And that was worked effectively in June, and we can deploy that system within 4 or 5 hours should we get advance warning of a rain event coming up. And we now have an standard operating procedure for the deployment of those skid-mounted pumps that can move quite a lot of water. Next slide. In the Heathcote, we've been doing a lot of work in the river. There's a lot of people saying that the Raupo and the constrictions in the channel are slowing down the water. There are some habitat benefits from having Raupo in there, and we understand the environmental benefits of the ecology, and we understand that it is being compromised, but we are putting the drainage requirements ahead of the ecological ones just for the time being till we restore the performance of the network. Next slide, we have a temporary stop bank that's been constructed in Ebb Tide Street on South Shore, and that protects a lot from that tidal flooding over the king tides that come through there. And on the next slide, we've got an example of a culvert in the Dudley stream at Guild Street. And you can see just by the diameter of the pipe there under that concrete structure, it is a constriction. And so during high flows, that becomes a dam and holds back the water, resulting in flooding into the properties behind it. So on the next slide, we've taken that away, installed a little footbridge, and it restores the channel to full capacity. A similar construction's planned for Chancellor Street, where we're removing an undersized culvert. In that case, we're cul-de-sacking the road, putting in a 2.5 metre wide pedestrian cyclist footbridge, and we've consulted with the neighbours there, and they've been very generous in their support of that project, and they're happy to see that work proceed. On the next slide, we talk with just some shots there of some of the work we've done in the channel works, removing vegetation, removing obstructions from the stream, trees, etc. And on the next slide, removing tons of silt from box drains. In this particular case in Truscott's drain, 600 millimetres of silt had accumulated in that from liquefaction sources. In the next slide, we talk about Littleton, where the flood mode is quite different. This is property to property flooding on steep terrain. There's 89 houses we consider as a high priority. There's some extra work continuing on the Littleton issue. 138 homes with medium risk or medium priority for investigation and remedy. And we're working with building control because some of these are private issues, drainage issues, how they deal with the water off their roof, how they deal with the water off their driveways, etc., as well as how we deal with water off the roads and the culverts there. So the next slide, we talk about the further investigations that are coming, one more advanced, and of course we'll do a little study looking at the private drainage issues across Littleton. And we've met out there with the residents, we've had a walk around there on a Saturday morning, and they've pointed out to us all of their concerns firsthand, and we've got a fairly good understanding of the triggers there. On the next slide, we talk about costs, and at the moment, work in progress or completed amounts to something like $10.7 million, which is currently funded out of the earthquake OPEX and what was set aside for the land drainage recovery work. Littleton, we have yet to come up with some firm costs, and we'll also have to look at what the operating costs in the land drainage area are at the completion of this work once we've got new assets and new regimes in place for the ongoing future management. On the next slide, we're talking about the pricing options for the Lower Heathcote, 4.6 potentially for temporary or stop banks at some location of the Lower Heathcote, working with strategy and planning on the strategic making room for the river project. So we're moving the stop banks further away from the rivers to provide sort of coastal tidal areas. And of course, house defence, we've identified 186 vulnerability 2, about 12 vulnerability 1, where you might have to do some sort of defence to the building because an area scheme doesn't provide for it. And so whether that's an insurance or an EQC or how that's funded is yet to be determined. So that's yet to be decided. The next slide, of course, is just the retreat option. We've done some early work on that, and we're going to look at refining some of those costs. So we're looking again at the Dudley option that was in the Land Drainage Recovery Program, to incorporate not only the option 1, option 2, which was the channel widening and the pump option, they're also adding a retreat option to that mix. And on the other side, doing a do minimum option if you wanted to maintain that level of service at 0.25%, what that might be. So we've got a full range from do minimum to do quite a lot. And then we'll look at the benefits and the costs. And we're sharing information with EQC and the insurance industry to get a better handle on what the economic value of doing this work is. Because some of the insurance recovery costs, the private insurers, we're talking in the tens and tens of millions of dollars in their costs, as well as what EQC have for increased flood vulnerability. The next slide just lists the recommendations that are set out in the report, and I won't go through those. You'll have those in front of you just now. And just the last slide is just about we're underway with many of the measures. We believe that a lot of the work we've done already has improved the situation for at least 65% of the vulnerability 1 people, but there's still decisions to be made across the city on the longer term permanent measures, as well as the approval of the future costs. And that's where the presentation ends. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Can we have the resolution up? And we've added in, we're going to add in Yanni's. I've sort of got part of one Britain, but I wanted that added to 7.6. But if I could have it back when it's done, because I haven't finished the other one. Right, so questions? Pauline?
One that was a real whirlwind tour. I feel like I've been up the creek in a canoe. Just on all the work that we're doing, particularly in the Dudley and the dredging and pulling out the junk out of the creek, what have we got left to do in that initial program that's not involving stage 2, which is the proposed widening of the whole thing? But in the remediation part, is there much left to do?
In the temporary works for the Dudley, a lot of that is already done. So we've got the temporary pumps, we've got the Tay Street underway, we've pulled out thousands of tonnes of liquefaction silt, and we're looking at private bridges, removing some of those and talking to owners about getting their bridges out of the way, because some of those are compromised. So those are still to be done, some private bridge issues. But we're not talking about the option 1, which is the big channel. We're talking major construction, resource consents.
Because what's in the back of my mind is there any chance that first stage of remediation work can actually prevent the flooding that we've had? Is there any chance of that?
It
because
can.
It hasn't been tested.
Yes, it can. Well, it was sort of tested in June. It will not prevent the similar result that we got on the 5th of March, which is a greater than 1 in 50-year event.
It won't be enough to...
It won't be enough to do the 1 in 50, but the question then comes back is what is the level of service that we're going to be happy to live with?
Right, thank you.
And that's the discussion.
Oh, sorry, Ali. Sorry, I'm busy watching the amendments going up on the screen over here, so you can't see what I'm looking at, so apologise.
John, having a look on page 161, there's talk about the preferences for non-engineering options. 4.8.3 mentions repair once insurance approach, and Pauline and I have been talking to several constituents who are in situations where their houses were damaged in the quakes, but they've also got damage from the flooding, and there's some disconnect between those two things. And with a couple of cases particularly, we've found that the alignment between the insurance companies and or EQC and, with regards to those repairs, we just can't get, except the insurance company's dealing with the flooding and EQC's dealing with the land and with the house if it was under. What's your experience from work you've done with the community on that?
Yeah, there is frustration about lining up all the various agencies, the banks, the insurers, EQC, the building control, and the flood response. That hasn't been resolved yet. We are trying to work collaboratively with the EQC and the insurance industry. We want to accelerate that work. I think time is of the essence here, because once EQC have the declaratory judgment, they have an option A to go ahead and write cheques for IFE to affected IFE customers. And once they start doing that, the opportunity for collaboration is gone. So we need to be very clear about how we can collaborate, what area-wide schemes will benefit the community and bring benefit to the insurers. But they want confidence that those measures are going to be effective, because they don't want to give us the money, put in a flood defence system that then fails, and they're back, they have an exposure again. So it needs to be a comprehensive, agreed piece of work that we all have confidence in the outcome.
I'm wondering whether we should take the 5.31.2 and almost like turn it into a resolution, so that there is some, specific direction from the council. Essentially that the scope of the physical works for Dudley Creek options 1 and 2 is presented during the meeting. This is the 27th of March 2014. On page 165, there's 5.31.2, so Dudley Creek long-term options. It talks about the 27th of March meeting where the two large-scale engineering works were put up. And it says that they need to be reassessed in light of the task force research and the short, medium-term works, i.e. the Tay Street pump station and in-channel works. And maybe what we need to do is actually pull that out as a resolution of the council to basically say that the council wants to see this those two options now reassessed in light of the task force research and the short, medium-term works, i.e. the Tay Street pumps and in-channel works, and report back to the council with a timeline that specifically identifies when we are going to, when different things are going to happen. What we're trying to do is create some certainty for people who are living with uncertainty. And I felt that within the report there was part of what we were looking for, but it wasn't reflected in the resolution. And, because requesting the Chief Planning Officer to undertake the further policy work, sort of based on the initial findings of the task force, I just don't think that that's giving people the certainty about what we're going to do. I think that having a specific resolution on Flockton, Dudley is a good idea, not because they are the only affected area, but because they are the most affected area. They represent 50% of those vulnerable or increased flood vulnerability, as EQC have defined it, that they have. And our definition of increased flood vulnerability is different from EQC's. They only look at the residential land and they're only measuring it from the LIDAR readings. And I think that we measure it from really the fact that they flood now and they didn't flood before the earthquakes. And largely that dates back to when the Dudley diversion went in. So it's kind of an irony that we've had to put in a pump to get to the Dudley diversion now. As part of the response to the flood damage. But the earthquake damage hasn't just been about damage to the land, it's been damage to the channels, it's been damage, with liquefaction, it's been damage with all of the, structural impediments to flowing, water flowing out of the area. And it's gathered, it's become, they refer to it as a basin, and it's truly become that.
And actually the report makes very clear that one of the very stressful things for people living in this area particularly is not only the flooding itself when it happens, but the prospect or threat of that flooding every time the sky darkens.
Every time it rains, yeah. And that was certainly the most powerful moment for me when I heard, and this was before I became the mayor, that when a mother said to me, my child doesn't fear the earthquake, she fears the rain. And so, so can we get some wording? Oh. Well, the council would like to see the Dudley, well, why don't you just call them the Dudley Creek options? Would like to see the Dudley Creek options, don't refer to options 1 and 2. Referred to in paragraph 5.31, so take out the point 2. reassessed and reported back to council. In terms of getting that sort of timeline, would it be reasonable to ask for that report back to be by the end of September? Because we're not asking you to make the final report back, but in terms of giving us that sense of, you know, when will you be in a position to give us a time frame around the decision making? It's not so much the decision making, but the time frame around the decision making. We need to set some timelines.
Yeah.
Milestones.
Well, we have to get through a procurement hurdle. It's a conversation I've actually had with Tom, who was leading the land drainage recovery program today. So to go back and reassess the options and put in the additional ones and come back with a comprehensive report in 4 weeks, it's a tall ask.
But what about coming back with a time frame for doing that work?
We did want to have this completed in the earliest possible timeframe, preferably before the end of October, before EQC get too far down the plan that they have for their option A.
Okay. Well,
October might be more realistic.
so if I said the end of October and reported back to council by the end of October?
I think that's achievable.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Ellie?
Just one more question with regards to the declaratory judgment and the work that's going on before that. Can you just clarify for me, John, how the work that we're doing now will still be relevant and may not be affected too much or even at all following the EQC declaratory judgment, as far as funding goes, for example, options available to homeowners? Are you able to
Yeah,
explain
well,
that?
as far as EQC are concerned, the ball's in our court. And the idea is that they will go ahead with their option to get the declaratory judgment on their assessment of how to distribute the funding for increased flood vulnerability. And their preferred path is to simply write 9,000 cheques. But they will change tack if we come up and say, here is a comprehensive approach to how we can mitigate a large, wide area of the community and give them confidence that it's going to work. So that's the sort of confidence. We need to give them that confidence fairly early, and I would suggest October, November is our window of opportunity, otherwise that disappears.
The declaratory judgment won't necessarily allow for that, will it? It's asking for a judgment on mechanisms by which they can be paid, but doesn't the EQC Act restrict as far as area-wide mitigation, for example, goes? I'm just wondering whether, are we doubling up on work?
The difficulty is that, I mean, I don't think that we should regard ourselves as restricted by the EQC payment.
Right.
I think that the government will be willing to talk to council about, you know, some sort of cost-sharing arrangement. We have provisions in other legislation that enables us to do that. So I wouldn't feel bound by it, but I agree with John that it is a timing thing that we should aim to fall, you know, sort of before the declaratory judgment. In very small cases, I mean, this is the trouble. EQC wasn't set up for this massive event, but thank goodness we had a government scheme in place, and it has encouraged a high level of insurance that other areas hit by disaster just simply haven't had. So, although, you know, I respect the fact that people have had real challenges dealing with EQC, better to be dealing with them than not dealing with them by not having that degree of coverage. But I think that one of the issues in terms of the way they've dealt with this in the past is they've been relatively small landslips, and they've got all of the owners to agree that the money be put into remediating the land rather than pay out individually. And I don't think people realise how little people get by way of payout when you think of the restrictions on the land cover. The land cover is only the land under the house, 8 metres around, the land under the driveway. You know, we learnt it all off by heart a few years ago. And unfortunately, or it's the minimum section size, or it's the cost of repairing the land, whichever is the least. So they will always be, and that's their legislative restriction, which is why I don't think we should think of ourselves as restricted by the EQC land damage or land repair requirements of their legislation. Yanni?
I just want to, first off, can I thank you for the work that you've done. I know you've done a huge amount of work, and you could almost name this the John Mackey task force, but that's okay. Thank you for coming up with this idea to start with, and I think it's been a really good approach. I just wanted to get an understanding for the people that had their houses lowered into a flood risk area, and the issue to do with not needing consents with foundation work. Where have we got to with that issue so that people who are looking at repairs going forward don't have their houses lowered? Have we made any progress around that?
We have been discussing that with Peter Sparrow and Building Control, and of course the building consent issue for waiving the building consent requirements was done in order to expedite some of those repairs, but it's got this unfortunate outcome that they don't need a consent, so it doesn't trigger the requirement to raise the house to the 50-year floor level or the 100-year under the district plan.
So could I move like an amendment or an additional resolution that we require a consent for any foundation work for houses that are in the new flood management areas?
No, because it's unenforceable. If you move that amendment, we can't enforce it.
So how do we progress? Like, I'm just really concerned.
It's one of the reasons why we've joined as a party to the EQC declaratory judgment,
Right.
precisely for that reason. And your example is precisely the example that's in our council affidavit.
Which is great, but I guess, I mean, I thought there was a joint kind of working group with EQC, insurers, bankers, government, MB, etc. Have they not come up with any short-term sort of immediate solutions to stop this kind of unquestionable thing happening? It just seems really, really strange that, you know, I can't be the only one concerned about it, and surely MB would think that this would be an issue. Is there nothing else we can do?
Well, we all share that concern, and we've had a lot of discussions, but the insurer don't see it as their responsibility. It's not a part of their insurance contract with their customers to do that work. It's not a requirement under the Building Act, the way that's worked. That was the reason we're trying to look at other options for house raising to assist people, but there is no easy solution or any quick solution.